Okay, you guys, last video for this particular non-renewables topic, we're going to talk about minerals and we're going to talk about mining. So just don't forget that we mine for fossil fuels. We also mine for minerals that we need, things like sand or salt, steel. I know you guys are all familiar with the steel mills that were here in our area in Pueblo. So we also mine for those rare earth metals, things that are found in LCD flat screens, and the batteries for electric cars. I think that that's kind of the thing that people think the most. They're like, "Oh, hybrids, they're really great." And yeah, they are great. They use way less fossil fuels, but they have these rare earth minerals in them that have to be mined for. So the mining is really bad for the environment, leads to habitat destruction. We'll talk about it. And then once you use them, they can't be recycled. You just put them in a landfill. So hybrid cars definitely have some downside. So for example, here we go. We're going to mine, we get out the ore. That's the stuff you get from the ground. You got to separate it, you got to smelt it, you got to refine it. It converts it into a product. And then we discard that product. The hope is that eventually we could get to recycle that product, but we're not currently there. So just something for you to keep in mind that those kind of these rare earth metals that go into the batteries of cars, that are going into your TVs. Elon Musk is trying to create like a solar house that has a giant battery in the roof, so you charge the battery during the day. And those are all going to take rare earth metals that they're pretty expensive and we don't have a ton of, and we need to kind of um, conserve. I'm sorry, I'm starting a timer so I don't talk too long in these videos. All right, so just something for you guys to consider that the mining of these things is still bad and it's still going to be used, and we have to take that into account. So it's important that we conserve the minerals that we have because eventually we will run out. So if we just use them and discard them once, this is how long we get them last. If we can recycle them, they'll last this amount of time. If we reduce, reuse, substitute them, then they'll last for even longer. And so it's important because the mining process is so damaging to the earth that we want to reduce, we want to reuse, we want to recycle, and all of those things so that we can make them last longer and prevent more of that mining. Mining is perhaps the most destructive thing that we can do here on Earth. So, with that, let's talk a little bit more about mining. Okay, so we need to go through some mining vocabulary first. So, when we extract a mineral out of the ground, we're extracting an ore. It's not pure. So, say for example, that we want to mine for copper, we're actually going to take out copper ore. And so, it's got copper and it's got other things that are mixed with it. When we separate, we're going to do a smelting process. So smelting is the process in which we refine or we separate out the mineral that we want from the rest of the waste. And we call that waste gangue, and we put it in large ponds called tailing ponds. Okay, so tailings is the waste material. I don't think you're going to have to differentiate between gangue and tailings, but just know that that's a waste product. So we extract the ore, and then it goes through a smelting process in which we separate the ore that we want from all of the tailings or the waste product. That smelting process causes massive amounts of air pollution and water pollution, so it's very harmful, and we want to try to find alternatives so that we don't have to go through that smelting process. We have a couple of different types of mining for coal. So that's specifically what we're talking about. But do keep in mind that we mine for other things like copper or aluminum. And so we have subsurface mining, which is pretty much like it sounds like. We're going to mine below the surface of the earth. And so we dig down these huge shafts and then we extract out the coal here. There are other shafts, ventilation shafts, in which they can bring down fresh air, and they can bring down, if you're down there for a long time, they pipe down food and other necessities that's down there. There was a pretty famous, I think maybe 2010, gold mine. I think in Argentina, definitely someplace in South America, in which this main shaft collapsed, and they were miners that were stuck down here. Did still have some ventilation shafts, but they weren't able to get back up them. And so what they did is 4 or 5 days afterwards, they finally made contact with them, and they said, okay, you guys are all still down there. They started sending down in small tubes foods, or not iPads, they didn't have iPads, but like iPods, like those very little ones from like when they first came out. I don't even think you guys would remember that. So that they could get to the miners. And eventually Texas A&M, woohoo, go Texas, said, don't worry, we can get your miners out. The only problem is that a couple of the miners is a little too large to fit in this new elevator. So they essentially had to build a new shaft shaft, and the new shaft that they were going to build had to be pretty small, otherwise other things would start to collapse. And so there were a couple of men that had to have like specific diets because they had to lose so much weight, so that they would fit in the new elevator that was able to go up and down the shafts. So great kind of engineering front, or feat. Kind of a funny story. I think one of the guys came up and his wife and his girlfriend were both waiting for him. I might have turned around and gone the other direction. But so subsurface mining is when we're going to go down under the earth and we're going to extract out the coal that way. Most of the coal otherwise is gotten from surface mining, which is exactly like it sounds like. We're going to strip it off the surface. And so strip mining, we dig these huge hole strips in the lands. We use heavy, heavy, heavy machinery. It's cheaper and safer than underground mining. Subsurface mining is super dangerous, especially in parts of China. Subsurface coal mining in China is the most dangerous job in the world. And however, this is massively destructive to the earth because you're essentially pulling away all of these layers of the earth. And so you see here, you can see the coal seam. We get out the coal. The overburden is the stuff that's on top of the coal that we have to dig out before we get to the coal that we want. And it has to be kind of put off to the side. And then eventually we're going to put it back where we found it. But strip mining is any type of surface mining is very, very destructive because we pretty much can't use that land for anything else. It's not like you want to go camping and backpacking where they're mining. Okay, mountaintop removal is pretty much what it sounds like. We blow up the top of the mountain and then we dig for the coal that's underneath. This happens heavily in West Virginia and other areas of Appalachia. We've seen that we've massively impacted the topography or the elevations, differences in elevations of that land due to mountaintop removal. Excuse me, for a long time, they just kind of blew up the top of the mountain, got the coal, and they were like, peace, see you later. And then finally the federal government stepped in and was like, yeah, you can't do that. You got to put the top of the mountain back on. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Open pit mining, this is often done for diamonds and other gold, things like that. And it's essentially what it sounds like. You're going to dig a giant pit and you're going to extract out the ore that you want. So we've talked, so that's pretty much mining in a nutshell. Just know that surface mining is a lot easier and cheaper to do than subsurface mining. The equipment, machinery is different. It's not any cheaper, but it's just different. But because subsurface mining is so dangerous, you have to pay the people more. Their health insurance costs more, and so it's a lot more expensive to do subsurface mining than it is to do surface mining. And you do need to be familiar with the different types of with surface mining, including strip, mountaintop removal, and open pit. One of the big downsides is after the mine is closed, it still rains. And so when that rainwater gets into the closed mine, it reacts with the tailings and everything that's left behind to create what we call acid mine drainage. And you can see it in this picture. It's that yellow liquid that's very, very acidic. And if that begins to seep out of the mine, it can run off into nearby water sources and kill all of the biodiversity there. So acid mine drainage is a major downside to mining. And again, that's caused by the rainwater and the chemicals that are used reacting with the closed mine and then running off into nearby water sources. So obviously it's very acidic. It's called acid mine drainage. You can remedy this by adding a base such as lime. The entire area surrounding a mine becomes acidic because of the chemicals that are used, as well as the ore that's kind of the tailings and stuff that are left behind become very acidic. And so we can fix any of the groundwater, we can fix any of the soil by adding a base such as lime. I would add that to your notes. The other major downside to mining is that it releases particulate matter and it massively disrupts the habitat. We see huge, huge, huge amounts of habitat destruction. No animal can live in this. No human wants to hike in this area. So we see massive amounts of habitat destruction. So when you're talking about the environmental impacts of mining, we want to talk about habitat destruction. We want to talk about contamination of groundwater or contamination of soil with acid mine drainage. If you talk about the human health impacts, that's breathing in that soot that's released when you mine, or that particulate matter that leads to respiratory illness such as asthma. You want to write all of that down. And so some people have proposed kind of mining in the ocean. There are large amounts of magnesium deposits that we need in the ocean. However, this massively disrupts the biodiversity and is not really a feasible solution right now. There is some legislation that regulates mining. We could talk about the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, and this requires a couple of steps. It says you have to reestablish the topography. If you blow, and you need to write these 5 steps down. If you blow off the top of the mountain, you got to put it back on. Then you need to return the soil. So if the soil became acidic, you got to make it neutral again, add a base such as lime. You have to add back the vegetation and the animals, and then you need to monitor for a specific amount of time to ensure that that has been returned to a natural area. We typically call those brownfield sites when they were a big mining site and then we've returned them to a natural area. We may call them brownfields. This is very expensive to do. In fact, we have lots and lots and lots of mining sites that have been kind of abandoned, and the companies go bankrupt and they say, oh, we don't have any money. That's not ours. We didn't do that. And so they're kind of hard to fix. They're very, very, very expensive to remediate, needing to fix back up. And that's part of why we see the coal industry declining, because natural gas just doesn't have that. So it's just a better alternative to coal. We do drill for oil. So you can drill for oil on land, you can drill for oil in the ocean, and most of them have a really specific or the same kind of process. You've seen the big oil rigs, and it's really funny for me to see the big oil rigs next to the windmills. If you've ever driven through like West Texas, you see those. And so here we see this oil rig. We drill down into the shale oil rock and we extract out the oil and they pump that back up. We can also inject seawater here, and that forces even more oil up and into the oil rig where it can be processed. Oftentimes we can get out the gas cap that's on top of that. We also want that for natural gas. So where we're drilling for oil, we also can drill for or extract out natural gas. After that, the petroleum has to be refined. We talked about that in our last video, and we do that through a boiling process or a distillation process. So basically we start to boil it, and at different temperatures, we pull off different products. So for example, we heat up the crude oil. Remember that the crude oil is the oil that we get out of the ground, and then we heat it up. And so the first kind of product that comes off is like heating oil that you might use, is diesel oil. And after that, it's heating oil that you might use in order to heat a home with. After that, it's kerosene. You guys probably only use that if you're camping, and then aviation fluid. And then the ones that are at the very top include like the gasoline that we put in our car, and then the natural gas that we use to heat our like if you have a gas stove. If we kind of cool that down, we can use that as a lubricant in an industrial process, and we also make asphalt. So again, I just want to emphasize that if somebody says, like for example, a politician, that we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, that's not realistic. What we need to do is use fossil fuels for the products that we need, and then find alternatives for transportation or electricity generation. One of the major downsides to oil is that it can spill. Oil is most often transported in a tanker. Tankers are not nearly as safe as pipelines. Pipelines are mostly pretty safe, although there have been some accidents and some reports. A lot of people are really against pipelines, including the Keystone XL pipeline, because they destroy habitats. They can destroy and leak, and they can get into aquifers where people have drinking water, and that's very, very problematic. The Keystone XL pipeline is problematic because it runs through, and therefore we have to dig up and disturb native burial grounds. And so the Keystone pipeline did go through an environmental evaluation process, and they determined that this was the least intrusive manner, although that has recently been stopped by an executive order. And so pipelines are safe. They're safer than tankers. They're still not great. We still want to find an alternative to doing this. But oil is processed through a pipeline, and sometimes that oil spills either out of the oil rig or out of the tanker or out of the pipeline. And so the biggest famous example is 1910, or 2020, I'm sorry, Deepwater Horizon was an oil rig that pretty much exploded. There is a movie, I think with Mark Wahlberg and Kate Hudson in it, that had that kind of, it showed that explosion. 5 million barrels of oil flowed into the ocean. The Exxon Valdez is another example that the captain of that one was actually drinking and put somebody else in charge, and he was inexperienced. He hit a reef out on Prince William Sound, which is by Alaska, and dumped oil all into that. Of course, the federal government is always like, oh man, we should have had a law preventing that. And so in 1990, the Exxon Valdez happened in 86 as well. And in 1990, they passed the Oil Pollution Act. This disrupts fishing grounds. It impacts commercial fisheries. So this Gulf of Mexico sees huge amounts of fisheries. So all those shrimpers, all those fishermen lost their jobs. It has to be cleaned up. It's really, really hard to clean up. It impacts tourism. It floods the gills of the fish. It blocks sunlight, so plants begin to die. So we can clean up oil spills in a couple of ways. We put these booms around it, which stop it from spreading, doesn't really clean it up. And then we can use skimmers and brushes to try to pick it up. We spray it with dispersants. So these are chemicals that break it down and then it'll sink to the bottom. Or we can put a big boom around it and then we can light it on fire and let it burn up. That releases air pollution. We're going to do a whole lab over this and talk more about it next unit, but I thought I would share a little bit. We want to be really careful where we're drilling for oil. The Alaska National Wildlife Refuge is a huge wildlife refuge that's obviously in Alaska. It's been proposed to drill for oil there, and that would be massively harmful. We see lots of vegetation being killed. This is a tundra, so it would take probably hundreds of years to repair itself. And if there was an oil spill, that would be particularly damaging. And it would cause habitat fragmentation due to the roads, disrupt wildlife, and degrade the local air and water. The last thing we want to talk about is fracking, and I'm going to play the fracking song in class. But in fracking, what we do is we drill these huge shafts down, and then we begin to drill horizontally, and we put this under pressure, and then we inject small pieces of sand or gravel that holds the cracks open, and then we pump out the natural gas that forms, that collects when we make those cracks. So again, we're going to drill vertically and then horizontally, and we put it under pressure, and therefore cracks start to form and the natural gas seeps out of the cracks and into the pipeline. We use sand to do that. Heavy amounts of water. So fracking is very, very water intensive, and it has to be fresh water. It can't be salt water. And then after you use that water, it is contaminated. You can't use it for anything else. And what are you going to do with it? And that's a huge problem. So George W. Bush said that it didn't have to meet Safe Drinking Water Act. And actually now what happens is they inject that water that they use down into the bottom, or into the layers of the earth. And we've seen that that actually causes earthquakes. Sometimes when you pump up this oil and this natural gas, it can contaminate this aquifer here. And so if you are somebody that uses that aquifer and it becomes contaminated with natural gas, your water will blow up. You sit down on the toilet and you do your business and all of a sudden the toilet explodes. So it's got to be pretty terrifying. So with that, that's all I have. I know this video was a little bit longer than I wanted, but I hope that that was helpful. My eyelash is driving me crazy. So have a great night, you guys.